Dear ladies and gentlemen, I warmly welcome you to the press conference on the topic Updates on Intergenerational Equity. My name is Anna Halbig, and I am a member of the Foundation for the Rights of Future Generations, a German organization that covers all topics concerning youth. Today's panelists are all heavily engaged in promoting intergenerational equity in the UNFCCC process. On my left side, we have Luke Kemp, a PhD student from Australia, then Tim Damon from Sustain Us, and finally, last but not least, Blessing from South Africa. All panelists will share now their ideas about intergenerational equity for around 20 minutes, and afterwards, if you want, you have the possibility to further engage in a dialogue and ask questions. Luke will talk now about the historical context of the principle of intergenerational equity. So the floor is yours.
Excellent. Thank you, Anna. That's better. So I'm just going to provide some quick context in terms of why you think intergenerational equity is important and what has happened previously since we started campaigning upon this in 2013. So intergenerational equity essentially is the idea that the earth should be passed on to future generations in at least as good a condition as it was inherited. So it implies this idea of a chain of obligations, that one generation has an obligation to future generations. It's quite a simple idea. It's one that's been present in many indigenous societies, including I think it was the Anasazi, who had this idea of always thinking ahead 7 generations before they would make a decision. However, modern-day society has lost many of these ideals around intergenerational equity, concern for future generations, so on and so forth. And as we can see now, this has led to many of the issues that we have, such as climate change, as well as other large-scale environmental issues like biological diversity. However, there has been this kind of emerging legal norm, this emerging legal principle and idea of intergenerational equity. We can see it in even the most typical definition of sustainable development, the Brundtland Commission, which confirms sustainable development as the idea of development presently which meets the needs of the present generation without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. It's also enshrined into the 1972 conference, Stockholm Conference on Human Development, as well as the 1992 Royal Earth Summit in Principle 5, and many other international treaties. Interestingly, there actually is a mention of future generations in the Climate Convention itself. Article 3.1 talks about the idea of protecting the climate for the benefit of present and future generations. However, the actual term intergenerational equity, which has larger connotation, which means a certain kind of equitable distribution across generations, not just simply protection, has never been enshrined into a legal constitution. And so noting this kind of lacuna in international law, a number of us youth got together and decided to make a difference and make a change internationally about this. And so we decided to really try to push for intergenerational equity as a principle to be recognized and enshrined into the 2015 agreement. First of all, this is a very big change in the terms of the discourse. So previously, the biggest ideas in climate negotiations have always been historical responsibility, CBDR, combat differentiated responsibilities. There's been a very little talk in terms of a longer-term perspective or in terms of future generations, anything like that. And one of the more subtle, but I think perhaps more pervasive and important changes we've actually made is bringing this discourse to life. So if, for example, we were at the high-level segment yesterday, you would have noticed Colombia, as well as the Philippines and many other countries mention the idea of either intergenerational equity or the protection of future generations in their speeches. And this happened at Warsaw as well. And there was also even a mention of future generations in the preamble of the Warsaw Outcome, which occurred due to our lobbying through certain groups, such as the ILAC grouping, who has become a very, very close ally of ours. ILAC being the Association of Independent Latin American and Caribbean States. So we've made our own personal goal to get this principle of intergenerational equity to become a founding pillar of the Paris Agreement. And we also have some ideas upon operationalizing it, which I think Tim will touch upon later. But yeah, essentially that's our story so far. We started in 2013, just a small group of youth who made a submission to the ADP on behalf of the wider youth constituency. We then created a working group, and it's kind of snowballed from there. And we now have over 100 youth working up on this. And it looks like it's only going to get bigger and better from here. We have had a lot of success here at COP20, and I think Tim will now be covering that. Tim, if you will.
Thank you, Anna, Luke, for giving us some background there. As said, we have been working on this since Warsaw, and we came to Lima with some very clear expectations. First of all, to build upon the language future generations that we had in the text previously, and to actually see that enshrined as intergenerational equity, and specifically to have this in the preamble of the elements text for the 2015 agreement. And along with this, we have some operational language as well. And this would be to actually make this principle meaningful, because it's one thing to have a nice, fluffy term that expresses warmth toward future generations. It's another to actually act upon that in a way that will give us a livable future for young and future generations. So the two concrete policy proposals that we've been pushing forward here have been, first, 0% fossil fuels by 2050, and then a 0% discount rate, social discount rate for the cost-benefit analysis of climate change. And that objective relates specifically to the INDCs. And we want countries to be transparent and accountable about what social discount rate they're using to support the economic justification of the INDC, because this percentage of the social discount rate is in many ways a good metric for intergenerational equity. And then also we've been encouraging countries to use a lower rate. So not just to report what their rate is, but to use one that is more equitable and just for future generations. And that's very technical, and I'm happy to address that either afterwards or if there are specific questions about that. We had a side event last week as well. We've also had several actions here that have been promoting that. So in terms of moving these policy demands forward, as Luke said, the ILAC nations have been particularly supportive. It's also worth noting that the entire Africa group signed the Warsaw Declaration on Intergenerational Equity, and we have an updated declaration for this year that we're seeking support for as well. And also a number of the AOSIS countries have signed on. And this makes sense because these countries need urgency very much, and so they're natural allies for young people who also feel a pressing need for urgency in this process. So we came very close in this process, which is still not quite over, and we anticipate overtime in the ADP, but we came close to having this term of intergenerational equity included. Chile brought it forward for us. They've been champions of youth, as we've said, and unfortunately this was blocked by Saudi Arabia. So our text as young people was not able to be inserted. And it's worth reiterating that going through parties is the only way that young people are able to have our voices inserted into the text of this process, because as observers, we don't actually get that seat at the table. So if it weren't for these countries willing to champion and ally with youth, our voices would have very little opportunity to make an impact. So where things stand now with the ADP, they are furiously trying to come to some kind of an outcome on the draft decision text for this COP. And this means that it's very unlikely that they're still going to address the elements text for 2015, which is where we wanted to see our language. Because after Saudi Arabia blocked us, we went back and built a much broader coalition of countries who are now willing to support us. So unfortunately, we may need to wait, however, until the next meeting in Geneva in order to be able to bring this forward again. But there are many barriers to youth participation. It's very costly, accreditations are limited, and so it's difficult to say if young people will be able to carry their voice into these smaller meetings that are very important happening throughout the year, because we can't wait until Paris to really be bringing this forward in a strong and concrete way. So a lot could still possibly change in the last few hours of this meeting, but whatever the outcome is going to be, the INTEQ group remains cohesive, it remains dedicated, and it stays sharp to the bitter end here and moving forward toward Paris. And at this point, I would like to hand things off to Blessing, who will talk about a related project to intergenerational equity called the Global Youth Manifesto Project.
Thank you, Tim. So I've been involved in the INTEQ working group since I came to COP, since last week. So I'm very new. So I'll give you a very, probably the good perspective of how I've been working with the Intergenerational Equity Working Group. So this is my first COP, and when I came, I was introduced to this working group. And pretty much it has been working for me because I really believe in the intergenerational equity, And just picking up from what Tim said, looking forward to Paris, that's exactly what we need, an agreement that that realizes the importance of intergenerational equity in the policies. So I'm going to talk about the Global Youth Manifesto project that we started talking about since last week. But as I know from the other members who are involved in this project, it's an idea that was born at Warsaw, and it has been a subject of many discussions, and there has been a lot of energy trying to bring this project to life. And I was fortunate to join this group, and then we started talking about how can we move forward with this Global Youth Manifesto project forward even after Paris next year. So far we have met several times and spoken about what is the vision that we have for this project, what is the outcome that we want from this project, and how are we going to go about it. And so far we have got very introductory documents in place and some timelines that we have put together. Basically the project is going to be about coming up with a values document, and the values are specifically going to be something that holds together the whole project, because we realize that as youth we come to this global platform, but we are coming with our diversity in culture, in maybe spirituality, and from our countries we also have different problems which we want to solve within UNFCCC negotiations. But how can we speak with a common voice and drive this process with common energy and common values and common vision? And we realize that having the Global Youth Manifesto project will be something that is aiming to drive this vision home to Paris and post-2020, and even going beyond. There's possibility that it will go beyond Paris. So we have come up with the values document, and we haven't come up with the values document, but we are in the process. We'll do a survey where the members and all youth members will be able to fill in a survey, and from the survey, we realize which values are the most important to people. And the other thing is the values will speak to the policy document. So the policy document will be born out of the values that we are considering as important. For instance, the value of humanity will touch on human rights and what is the role of intergenerational equity in terms of human rights. So that's something that we're talking about, and it's something that will give cohesiveness to our working group. So far we have created platforms on Facebook, and we have launched a website. And moving forward from now, we're going to launch the surveys. They're going to be online based, and we have a working team that is willing to take this project forward. So far we have volunteers, and I'm part of the working group within the Global Youth Manifesto, taking the vision forward. And we have come up with a strategy of how we're going to implement it even after COP. So it's pretty exciting, and energy levels are pretty high, especially here at COP. So we're trying to tap into those energies amongst and within the youth, and we have got so much good response from the youth, and this is something that they want. So we hope the project will deliver its vision, which is to give cohesiveness and which is to guide the negotiations and what we need as youth within UNFCCC. So I think that's pretty much we have, but if you have any questions, I'll be willing to give any answers after this press conference.
So thank you, Luke, Tim, and Blessing for all your interesting presentations. Let me just sum up in short. Luke introduced the principle of intergenerational equity. He explained that it is already covered in the UNFCCC convention, but he aims, or the INTEQ working groups aims to promote it also in the 2015 agreement. Tim said the INTEQ working group has mainly two aims. Firstly, a 0% carbon emission rate, and secondly, a 0% discount rate. And Blessing introduced us to the Global Youth Manifesto project. that touches upon the common values of young people, and that will be published in future, and we are all looking forward to it. So now the floor is yours. I already saw a question over there, so yes, please. Yes, there's a microphone.
Thank you. Two questions. I understand you wanting to have a voice in the process. Is that the main reason for getting this language in the document, or do you expect this language to have some teeth and give the documents some real power? Secondly, I noticed everyone is very young here, and coming from a couple of generations ago, and probably the oldest person here in the room, I have to ask you, I know that you're all very young, you all flew here, many Apple computers, many Apple iPhones. That took industry, and flights have carbon emissions. Is your generation willing to give up those things? Because that's what you're going to have to do if we go to zero fossil fuel emissions.
You want to take the first one? I'll take the second.
Thank you for that question. I think we will pass it on, whoever is willing. Luke, please.
So I think the idea would be I take the first question, Tim would cover the second question. So in terms of the first question, of course, naturally, the idea of youth having a voice is an important one, and one we are pursuing, and that was a driving force behind it. But I think people often underestimate the value that legal norms can play. For example, a story I always go back to is the idea of having universal participation. So whenever people think of global agreements now, they always think of something that is totally global. It has all countries on board all at the same time. And we take it as conventional wisdom now that it's always been like that. And it's something we're pursuing now in the actual 2015 agreement, which is why things are so difficult. But that is actually a very, very recent legal norm which has emerged. The Montreal Protocol, which addressed ozone depletion, didn't have China on board. Didn't have a huge amount of countries on board, actually. But after that, it became kind of this emerging legal norm that we had to have universal participation. And the UNCCC took that on. It's become a kind of key aspect ever since. And so norms have power. International relations is basically made of norms. So I do think that even just that changing discourse itself is extremely powerful. But that aside, I do think that it can have some teeth. So I think Tim mentioned the idea that once we have that principle there, it provides leverage to push for certain policies. One of those being the idea of having a 0% discount rate. So I think Tim can probably provide a better explanation of that. But essentially when countries put forward their pledges, the entire idea of a pledge and review system is that the review should be very effective. When they put forward their pledges, if they do an economic analysis which has a long-term perspective and doesn't use this discount rate which discounts future impacts, it actually shows that mitigation is much cheaper, especially in the long term, and much more beneficial than people really think. And so it provides a really strong leverage point and a really strong point of comparison to review these targets. And so it's actually perhaps one of the most effective ways to make a pledge and review system better and actually make sure that kind of compliance and that facilitative aspect comes into it. So I think INTEQ is important both as a norm, but it can also be the basis for some extremely useful and innovative mechanisms.
I would like to just add a little bit more to what Luke said. I think the principle here within intergenerational equity really is, personally, my working principle is, what is the future that I really want to live in 30, 40, 50 years from now? We basically see that we are here because of previous decisions that have made us to be here. So what is the possibility of changing the course of things and the course of how things are happening and working? And, you know, and for me, really the dangerous place to be is to be that of despondency and thinking I cannot make change, I won't be able to make change. But it's about seeing motivation and what is the possibility of doing things differently from now going forward. Yes, we might be stuck with the current economic systems, but what are the alternatives that we can start adopting now? If you look at grassroots level organizations, that's where the real solutions are happening. But that also comes with the policies. So whatever we put into policies will permeate to the grassroots level. So for me, really, it's a point of where do I get motivation and what is the possibility of changing things around?
Thank you, Luke and Blessing. answer both questions in an integrated way, having the strength in the text is very important to make sure that we're establishing at an international level these new norms and ideas. But we need to be advancing these same ideas domestically as well. And this is where it comes into our generation and the changes that we will need to make, the transition that we will have to author through our own actions. And this requires a lot of peer-to-peer education because, yes, those of us sitting up here and many of my colleagues who are filling this room right now, we get it about climate change and the need for sustainable development. But not all young people are there yet. It's a very wide spectrum, and particularly in the United States, there's many other complicating factors for this. But I've seen a lot of progress, having worked on sustainability at the university level, both for my undergrad and for my master's. And so these programs are growing, and I really do think that our generation is moving toward this transition, and it needs to occur through education and peer-to-peer communication. And this is actually another piece of INTEQ. When we're not here, these meetings are only one thing that's going on the yearly agenda. We're doing trainings, we're providing educational content via, we'd like to create online courses to help ramp this up and really make sure that young people are learning what it's going to take to make this transition. And we've inherited a system that is not the one we want to move forward with, but it's a very legitimate and challenging question. But we're moving in the right direction, I would say. And I'm optimistic that we'll figure this out. And that's why we come here with these concrete proposals that are much more specific as well for how do we actually implement an agreement that would be consistent with intergenerational equity.
Thank you for your answer. I see there's another question. Yes, please.
Yes, I'm a bit puzzled by the zero discount rate. Two ways to think about that. One is apparently that would indicate that $100 today is equal. $100 today is equal to $100 100 years from now, and vice versa. Correct? That doesn't seem intuitively correct to me.
All right, so we're very limited on time. So to answer this very concisely, from a universal point of view, and this is something economists themselves have debated for a long time, good at one point in time cannot be judged differently from good at another. Now, as a practical matter for how we go about this, we are open to flexibility on the discount rate to be between 0 and 1.4%. And the 1.4% comes from Lord Nicholas Stern's review on the economics of climate change. And he already pushed the boundaries in terms of how much you could lower the discount rate for what's acceptable right now among economists. But this was actually the subject of my master's thesis, and the specific point is if you really want to do intergenerational equity, it means a 0% discount rate. We could even talk about a negative discount rate, but this is meant to be guiding our analysis. We still then have to translate this into concrete policies, and that's where we're very much grounded in the realities of what the discount rate means and how you specifically implement it. That's a much more technical discussion I'm happy to follow up on. But as our specific policy point, from an ethical standpoint, it's very clear that the 0% rate is consistent with intergenerational equity.
Just quickly, briefly add to that, not from an economist background, I have read the book for economics, but that's essentially the extent of it. I think the discount rate makes a lot of sense when you take kind of the typical ceteris paribus assumptions of economics, that you will have growth over time, interest rates are going to have a certain steady rate, so on and so forth. But when you're entering the area of the Anthropocene, when you have huge-scale biodiversity loss, impacts of climate change, so on and so forth, these huge irreversible changes, that's when those assumptions come under a very, very critical questioning, I think. And more importantly, the discount rate works well when it comes to certain things like investments. When it comes to human lives being lost in the future, all you're essentially doing is discounting the lives of future generations, which to me is both economically foolish and also morally repugnant.
Okay, thank you. Due to time issues, I think there's only room for one more question. Is there one more question? No. Okay, so I see there's not even time for one more question. So I thank you all for your attendance, and I hope you get some interesting insights and go home with more information. Thank you.
Thank you.